a time where heroes lived. People like Salahuddin, who gave his life for Islam, our legacy.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All praise belongs to Allah, and may His peace and blessings be upon His Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Dear viewers, welcome back to another episode where we're looking at Islamic history. Today, inshallah, we're going to take a look at the history of Islam in the USA, the history of Islam in America.
America have already a history in Islamic history?
No doubt about it. As we've taken a look at, some of the other episodes, taking a look at countries like Australia, taking a look at Europe, you see Islam is found all over the world. And America is no exception. Insha'Allah, we're going to look a little bit about, the history of things that happen, but also certain points about the history of Islam in the USA that are really, I think they're going to blow your minds. You're going to say, oh my God, I really never knew anything about this. Insha'Allah, this is what I hope to achieve by the end of this episode, Insha'Allah. Now, we do have an American with us, don't we?
Yes.
Yes. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name's Zaid. I'm from America, and I'm from the USA.
Whereabouts in the USA are you from?
I'm from New Jersey, right
From
next
New
to
Jersey.
New York.
Oh, okay.
And in
Alhamdulillah.
New Jersey, alhamdulillah, there's a lot of Muslims in New Jersey.
You've got many masajid.
Yes,
and
many masajids, and the culture there. There's even masjids with Arabic khutbahs and all that stuff. It's a good population.
You've got
Good
halal
community.
butchers.
Of course, you have halal butchers. Halal restaurants. Grocery stores, just run by Muslims. All of that.
Alhamdulillah, this is very, very good to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to rewind. We're going to go back to the start, the beginning of Islam in the USA. Now, we know USA was called the New World because you had Europe, you had Asia, you had Africa. And these were the three main continents of the world. And many people speculated, they said maybe there's another land. It was actually interesting. A lot of the early Christians, they actually said that it's impossible that there's going to be another land other than these three continents. And this was the view of some of the people in the Christian church. Because they said the fact that there's three continents proves the Trinity.
Yes, because in the Bible they said that the earth is a round plate. Bible.
This is a whole nother issue that we're looking at. But they said the three continents, the three continents that actually joined, three distinct continents, but they're one large continent, Europe, Asia, and Africa. A lot of people in the Christian church use this as a justification to justify the Trinity. So they said if there's another continent, this proves the Trinity wrong.
Of course, yeah.
It's something strange for us to, we know today you've got more than, these three. You've got Australia, Antarctica, you've got the Americas. But this was one of the views that was held at the time. If you said there was something beyond these three, you're considered a heretic.
So today, because that we have septinity, for nowadays we have 7 continents. So we have septinity.
We won't go into the Aqidah, the theology of
Regarding,
continents.
regarding is there 6 or 7? So we have septinity or sectinity.
Alhamdulillah, we know as Muslims, the whole world Allah has created this. And Allah is above His creation, and He's one. He's, Wahid al-Ahad. So, khair. There was, a lot of speculation about, this new world, and the Europeans, they wanted to travel to this new world, to, see the things that it might have, see if they could get something out of this. Now, eventually, we know that Columbus did eventually travel to America. He didn't actually come to the mainland of America, but he got to the Caribbean, to this area, and this was in 1492.
And we listen that he is a hero.
According to some people, and I'm sure that you would have seen in the USA around Columbus Day, a lot of the Native Americans, they say he's no hero, he's a criminal. He began the invasion of our lands. So you see, there is a lot of debate about the role of Columbus. We know as Muslims, because 1492, it's a significant year in Islamic history, because this was the fall of Granada, this was the end of Al-Andalus, and as we know, 1492. Was the fall of Andalus, and the same year that America was discovered. And we'll talk about why it wasn't discovered properly. Discovered, of quotation marks around it. What had happened basically was the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, they was all of their money was going towards, their fight against the Muslims, the Reconquista, reconquering the lands. So come 1492, Christopher Columbus, he's been begging the king and queen, saying, please fund my mission so I can go and discover these new lands. What he wanted to do was actually discover a new route to go to India. So rather than, having to go through the mainland, he wanted to find another route
Because
to actually get to India.
the route in that day was across the Muslim lands.
Yes.
So we see that the reason because of the Muslims. Because as we seen in this all shows that they're all the reasons for this Muslims, because the Muslims, for example, for Magellan, the Muslims were the first after Greece and the Romans to say that the plate that the Earth isn't a plate. So the Magellan has gone to prove this. So it's all about Muslims.
Yeah, and this is part of the reason, because they wanted to avoid the Muslim lands, Central Asia.
And and he all what he wanted to take fund to see other way going to India.
Yes.
Why India?
India was, got the land of spice. You'd go there, and India had a lot of things available. The best spices. A lot of commodities, things like this. So
Trade.
they wanted to find from
For
trade.
business.
Yeah, absolutely trade. So this is why he said to the king and queen, you fund my mission. First it's going to give him his livelihood. He's an explorer, but it's also going to justify, trade for the empire. It's going to generate business. It's going to be better for them.
And I heard that he didn't discover the America, but he get lost and the people find him and
this is what happened. He was looking for India. And
he stumbled upon it.
Bumped into the Americans.
He died convinced that he discovered India, that he's in India, that he's in India.
This is why he said to the natives, "You're Indians." This is why they call them, the Native Americans. They call them Indians until today, because Columbus had no idea where he was going.
Islands are known as West India.
Indeed. So what had actually happened was 1492. All of a sudden, the king and queen, they're not going to say no to Columbus anymore. Why? Because now they're not spending money on fighting the Muslims. Now they're taking the treasures of the Muslims. Granada's fallen, and the wealth of the Muslims is theirs. So now they, with this money, they say to Columbus, now you can go. So he used the wealth of the Muslims.
Muslims, actually, these Muslims who fund the Columbus journey.
Indirectly. They didn't fund him directly, but it was from the treasures of the Muslims that they could now do so. And it's interesting to note that Columbus, the maps, for example, that he was studying, these were Muslim maps. These are maps in Arabic.
His crew was Muslim.
This is what we'll get to in a moment,
and
inshallah.
Spain at that time was the poorest country in the Europe. Before conquesting the Granada in that time.
Yes.
It was the poorest country.
And in the north of Spain, it was impoverished. Once they took Andalus, they took the wealth of Andalus. So Columbus, he started to study the maps of the Muslims, because the Muslims are the best map makers in that time. Had Al-Idrisi, who was living in Palermo in Sicily. He was a famous map maker. He was a Muslim making these maps in Arabic. So Columbus is studying the maps of the Muslims so he can get to India. Now, the place where he actually did his studies, his study, if you like, this building, you can actually visit it today. And you find that this building, it actually used to be a masjid.
Whoa, in Granada or where?
I'm not sure. It wasn't in Granada. It's in a city a little bit far away from Granada. But you can visit it today. And, they don't tell you it's a masjid. But you actually put a little bit of study into it, and you take a look at the architecture of the building. This actually used to be a masjid. So they've kicked the Muslims out. They've said to Columbus, this is your study. Here are their maps. Here's their money. Take this.
Took the and they gave him the masjid of Muslims.
Yes. And with this, he sailed. And as you mentioned, it's speculated. There's a lot of difference of opinion about this. But no doubt there were Arabic speakers on that ship. People that spoke Arabic.
Ship who go to America, who discovered the America.
The one who discovered America. And it said many of them were Muslims.
I've heard that. I heard the story that there's Muslim people went there before Columbus or something like that.
This is what we're going to talk about in a moment, inshallah. But talking about the ship of Columbus.
I've actually heard that his right-hand man was a Muslim.
It's said, and again, this is speculation. There's no hard historical fact. But we know at least there were Arabic speakers on the boat. No doubt about this. People spoke Arabic. They're coming from Andalus, from the Muslim lands.
His translator for the Arabic was some Jew who converted to Christianity for the translation of this mass, because he didn't know Arabic.
Yes.
Columba.
So what had happened?
So at this time, the Arabs, they had more advanced maps than basically where he was from. So that's how.
Yeah, this was from his land. The Muslims of Andalus had the best maps. So now they've conquered Andalus, he's taken the maps, he's taken the wealth, he's taken the masjid to study in, and he set forth. And it said, some of his crew were Muslims. And we know that after the fall of Andalus, the Inquisition, which happened later on, the Muslims had to hide their faith. So if you're a Muslim, you might say, okay, I'm a Christian to save yourself from being persecuted, but reality is, at heart, you're a Muslim. And there are some accounts, again, these aren't necessarily stated in history, but there's the story that his right-hand man was a Muslim, and he actually rebelled against Columbus. During the travel to the Americas, he actually fought against him, and he declared jihad against Columbus, basically.
In the ship.
This is what recorded. Once they made it to land, he said to the Muslims on board, "Let's fight Columbus, this crusader, if you like."
And the Christian history recorded that it was just about rebellion because the traveling is so long. As we saw that when Magellan came, that we said only Philippine natives killed him, but as we see as in Philippine and also in regarding Colombo, it is all about Muslims.
Yeah, you find it everywhere they went. They were Muslims. And, we know that when Columbus landed, he landed around Cuba, for example. As we say, he never made it to the mainland. And in Columbus's diary, you see, he actually, when he landed, he said there were moros.
Moros, it's
Moro.
Muslim.
Moros, the word, the Andalusi word for a Muslim. He said there were moros in Cuba. He said the women dressed like the Muslims of Andalus. Their women dressed in dresses like the Muslims of Andalus. He said there was a hill in Cuba. He says on this hill there was a masjid.
Masjid?
Subhanallah, really?
A masjid.
Masjid in America before anyone
This is
discovered
in the
it.
Americas, in Cuba.
In Cuba.
He said this is in his personal diary, and he said we found people who prayed 5 times a day. He's spelling it out for you. There were Muslims in the Americas, even at the time of Columbus.
How this happened?
This is what we want to look at.
So we can
This is
say
what we
that Muslims discovered America, discovered Australia, discovered the Philippines before Christians.
What we say is they made it there before the Europeans.
That's because they didn't discover, the people were there before.
Of course. Now, as for speculating exactly how there would have been Muslims before, in the time pre-Columbus, there's a number of theories. Each of them, is valid in many ways. We know, for example, there's no doubt at the moment. We know that the Vikings of Scandinavia, they did make it to the Americas long before Columbus. This is documented. It's well known. However, the moment that you say Muslims made it to the Americas, the controversy gets thrown in. There's a sheikh in America. His name is Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick, and he actually he wrote a book called Deeper Roots. And the whole premise of Deeper Roots is he's talking about how Muslims made it to America long before Columbus. And he positioned that it was Muslims from West Africa. So we're talking about Ghana, Mali, all of these areas. And he showed why there's a lot of justification that they made it to the Americas. He showed, for example, that in America you find many of the Native American Indians. They have words related to the West African languages, like the Mandingo language, for example. The Native Americans in the part that he said they would have made it to, they speak very similar. The words for gold, for example, the words for things that would have been traded, they're very, very similar. There's a tribe of American Indians called the Mecca Indians.
Mecca?
The Mecca Indians. And there's no doubt about it. We saw later on, again, reports of Native American Indians who would pray to the West.
So
They bow down in prayer like the Muslims.
For example, the sailors from Morocco, do they were in America?
We'll stick with Africa for now, and we'll move on to these.
They were in America.
We'll stick with Africa first, and then we'll move on to this. We know as well, that there's physical evidence that Muslims were in America before Columbus.
And what is it?
One of the physical evidences is you find writings on rocks. Now, what they would do is they would actually write things into rocks with sharp objects. You'd find the name of Allah, for example. You'd find the name of Allah.
Allah was Arabic.
In Arabic. You'd find certain du'as. There's one dua, basically, I can't remember the exact way, something along the lines of A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, for example. Written on a rock. And, this can be, carbon dated to the time before Columbus. So we know there were Muslims. Whether they were the ones from West Africa or not, Allah knows best. Now, what Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick talked about is he proved how they could make it to the Americas. If you look at the currents going across the Atlantic, It shows how their boats could have easily made it to the Americas. The problem was talking about how they got back. Because, you know, it suggested that they made it back. And I remember he was saying once, he was actually sitting down with some historians from one of the universities in Canada, and they said, we've got no problem agreeing that the Muslims made it. You know, the West African Muslims made it to America. Got no problem with this.
But maybe they not go back.
Yes, they say, how do you prove that they got back? And he says, this is what I can't prove. You've got physical evidence there were Muslims there. Whether it was the West Africans or not, we don't know. We know in Al-Andalus, it was very famous, a story about a group of explorers who went from Andalus and they sailed to the west and they came to a new land. And they dealt with the people, they traded with them, and they made it back. This is a well-known story in Andalus. And going by the descriptions of what they're talking about, it had to be the Americas. Whether it be North or South America, Allah knows best. Some say they would have reached, for example, Brazil. Could have been, you know, the Caribbean, could have been North America. But this story was well known.
We have one more indicator, the maps from Colombo. He take the Arab maps. Why? Maybe we say that we can. Maybe he knew that they maybe have the America in that maps or some way to India.
Yeah, without doubt. Now we see further than this. You know, there was a book that was written by a historian named Gavin Menzies, and it's called 1421, the year the Chinese discovered America. Sorry, the year that China discovered America. So this is going 70 years before Columbus. Now it was known that the Chinese had maps that clearly showed North America. Clearly showed. You know, from around the time of Columbus, they had these maps. And as we know, we talked about him when we were looking at Islam in China. You had the Chinese Muslim general, Zheng He.
Maybe he made it there and he give for them Islam.
This is a possibility, but we know that Zheng He, if he came from China, he would have come to the west coast of America. But we know, along with this, you know, if he made it to the west coast, we know there were also Muslims on the eastern coast. This is where Cuba is. So it could have been that Muslims made it to the east coast of America and the west coast of America. You know, it said Zheng He had these maps. The Yuan dynasty, they had maps clearly showing America. There's no doubt about it. When you look at this,
Before
you're
Columbus.
sure.
Before
Columbus.
Columbus.
We're talking 70 years before
Wow.
Columbus. So you see that, you know, there are many evidences showing that the Muslims would have made it before. You've got physical evidence, and you find that this it creates a lot of controversy. As we were looking when we were talking about the history of Islam in Australia, when you prove there were Muslims before the Europeans, you're redefining the history of your land. You know, when you legitimize the history of Islam in your country, that Muslims were there long before. You know, they found it before, you know, Columbus, the European, discovered it. This changes the way that you think about the country.
You are losing losing the ability to ban some things, to ban azan, to ban some maybe the wearings of Islam like hijab.
Exactly. And if you wanted to come to a Native American Indian in the USA and deprive him of his rights, he'll say, no, I'm a native of this land. You can't oppress me. And they're going to be a lot more careful with the Native American Indian because he was there before you. You've got to show him some respect. And we know there were Muslims before that. So it's going to change the psyche of the people. And you find that there were some books that were actually written showing the evidence that there were Muslims in the USA. And some of these books had to be protected in the libraries.
And these books written by Americans?
By Americans.
By Americans.
There's a book, I think it was called Quest America. In this book, it was on display, I think it was in the Boston Library. It had to be protected by security guards because so many people would try to destroy this book, you know, wanting to destroy the evidence of Muslims in America. And this is why, as we were saying in our introductory episode, you know, history becomes a political tool. The moment you can prove there were Muslims in America, you know, before Columbus, it's going to change the way that people are going to think. So people want to cover this up. But alhamdulillah, now, especially in the age of the internet, technology, you know, more than ever, you can't hide these things anymore. You know, the people, they know about this. It's accepted. Columbus was not the first person to make it to the Americas.
I guess that would just change, you know, Americans saying it was found on Christian values. You know, when they talk about Abraham Lincoln and basically all those things, you know, if Muslims did actually go there first, that would be just a total change.
It's going to change everything. And we are actually going to talk about this later on, inshallah, about the forefathers of the USA and their religious views and the role that Islam actually played in this. Now, after this, you know, the possible involvement of West Africans or Andalusi Muslims or Chinese Muslims in the Americas, we're going to fast forward to the slave trade. Now, as many of us will know, I think anyone who knows a little bit about the history of America, you've heard about slavery. What would happen is the Europeans, the British, the Americans, they'd basically sail into West Africa, attack and take as many slaves as they could, take them back to America and sell them as slaves. And they'd be forced to work on the cotton plantations, be forced to, work in their houses to look after their people. And the history of slavery is well known in the USA.
And the U.S. is like one of the first things you learn about.
Yeah, the US is a prime example of this. And it's said that 1/3 of the slaves were Muslims. We know for sure that many of these slaves were Muslims.
All the slaves coming from Africa.
The vast majority of them, at least 99% of them were from Africa, especially from West Africa. So we know around West Africa, you had the Mandinga Empire. You had, many, many Muslim empires at this time.
Mali, you have I think Borno, something like this. In Ghana, you have this, and some of these Muslims was as scholars.
Yes,
So,
and
yes.
this is what we're going to see in a moment.
It's actually pretty interesting about. I was actually listening to someone. He said basically when the slaves came and the owners would tell them to do stuff. Their reply would be like "woke," and basically "okay" is a word that is used till today in the English language.
This is a folk etymology, and it's one of the suggestions for this. It's if we got time to look at the etymology of words, I'd love to have a show just about this. I don't know if it will be as interesting as the history though. But this is one of the ways where they say it's possible the word "okay" was taken from the slaves.
This means slaves who built the bases of America.
Yeah, they were the workers. They were the workers who worked for free basically. They were never paid for their work. Now we see there's a very famous series. It was called Roots. Roots was a very, very famous series that was made in the USA, and it talks about the history of African Americans. Now, Roots, I'm sure you've heard of O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was actually in Roots. Check it out. It's a very interesting series, and it focuses on there's a character. His name's Kunta Kinte. Kunta Kinte is a slave. He's taken from Africa, and you see he's a Muslim.
He was Muslim.
He's a Muslim. This is it's not completely factual story, but it was inspired by true events. And we know, as we said, many of them are Muslims. And you see that, even O.J. Simpson, he plays a Muslim in this. And they greet each other by saying, peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum. So you see this in Roots. It shows the history of this family, how they came as Muslims. But eventually their religion was taken away. By the third generation, they weren't Muslims anymore. Once you're a slave, it's like your soul is taken away to a large extent. You had slavery that took place in some areas of the world where it was, you could call it a benevolent type of slavery. Well, the slaves were really given a better life to some degrees. The slavery in the USA, however, it was complete opposite. The slaves suffered. Their religion was taken away. Things were very difficult for them, to survive at this time. Now, it's well known that many of these slaves spoke Arabic. For example, there was one American, he actually spent a lot of time in Turkey. And in Turkey, he learned to speak the Arabic language. And so when he was in the USA, he actually heard a lot of these slaves speaking, and he heard them speaking Arabic. So he actually spoke with them, and he sat down with some of them, asking them about their history. Some of them would say, I was an alim, my father was an alim, he was a scholar, and his father was a scholar. Scholars of Maliki fiqh, of the Maliki madhab. Knowing their genealogy, and some of them were, princes, and now they're slaves, and they're relating their history. And you say, as we said, about 1/3 of these slaves were Muslims.
Because, for example, in Timbuktu, it was the big capital.
In which, sorry?
The Timbuktu in Mali, it was a big capital. And they
Timbuktu is very, very well known as the
took
center of
slaves from
Islam. No. So what we're going to do, we've got to the point of slavery, which has got many interesting things to come. We're going to go for a very short break. So, dear viewers, do stay tuned. We'll be back with you in a very short moment.
Our legacy.